Hi, I'm Ashley with Campbell. Thanks for investing your time to help your community be a great place to live. Before you watch the video, make sure to click the subscribe button so that we can help you make educated decisions as a board member.
Ashley, thank you very much. Let me make sure that everyone can see the screen share. You see a green backdrop right now?
Looks great.
Okay, cool. Well, hello, everyone. Happy New Year. Thanks very much for joining us today. My name is Will Simons. It is a pleasure to be with you virtually. It's our first webinar of the year, so I'm excited to kick things off with you today. I want to say thanks to Ashley and Dan and everybody at Campbell Property Management for inviting me to do the webinar with you all today. Always great to work with you guys. Some of you in the audience may have seen we've done this one several times before, but I think it's always a relevant message. So thank you guys for the opportunity to be here. I like to just say hello on camera here at the beginning just for a moment. I'll turn my camera off during the class itself just so everybody can focus on the slides and all the material. We've got a lot of great stuff to cover with you all today. So just by way of introduction, today's class is called Reserve Funding Methodologies. I think it's a great course for board members, managers, anybody who's familiar with the industry, who's looking for more background about reserves and the different ways that associations can fund their reserves. Would trim down the course a little bit this year. I'm thinking it hopefully will run for maybe 45, 50 minutes. So we may have a little bit more time for Q&A than we sometimes do. We always have a ton of questions come in. As Ashley mentioned, please feel free to submit those during the course using that Q&A button on your Zoom taskbar. And when we get to the end, I will try to stay on as long as I can, answer as many as possible. Most of the time, there's more questions than we have time to answer them. So apologies in advance if we don't get to yours. I do appreciate them, and we'll try to get through as many as we can with the time that we have. So quick reminder, it's only happened one time, but I feel like I always have to say it. If I have any technical difficulties, if we lose power, if I lose internet connection, and for some reason the screen freezes up or something like that, please stay in the meeting. I will try to reconnect as quickly as possible. If it doesn't look like it's going to work out, then we'll have to send out a recording or something another time. But fingers crossed that doesn't happen for us today. Again, just as Ashley mentioned there, we will be sending out the CEU course credits to the DBPR. Usually takes us at least a few days to get through those. So maybe by sometime next week, you can check and make sure that your credit's posted. If you are a CAM and you're signed up today, you will have already provided your CAM license number as part of that registration process. So there's no need to call or email and make sure that we have that. I know a lot of people always just want to double check, but if for some reason you did attend and don't see the credit posted, feel free to let us know next week if you're not seeing it there by then. But I'll go ahead and switch my camera off and we will get started. So thank you very much. Okay, all right. So before I begin with the class itself, I'll take a moment just to introduce myself and our company in a little bit more detail. So as I said, my name is Will Simons. I'm the president of the Florida office for our company, which is called Association Reserves. I've been with the company since 2008. I've completed and overseen over 3,000 reserve studies in my career. The RS you see there after my name, that stands for Reserve Specialist. Those who are unfamiliar, that's an industry-specific credential that's only awarded to people who have demonstrated their experience and expertise in preparing reserve studies. That designation comes from CAI, the Community Associations Institute. I'm sure most of you are familiar with CAI already. As of right now, we have 5 reserve specialists among our Florida staff and a few dozen more scattered around the country. Very pleased to know that we've got a handful of our additional staff in Florida who should be getting their RS credential this year. So we're very excited about that. Personally, I've lived in both condos and HOAs. I've been a board member. I spent about 6 years serving as the treasurer of my HOA in South Florida. We had a budget there of a little over $1 million. About 635 home community. And the reason that I point that out is because I do know what it's like to be on the other side of the table. I know that it's a difficult job, a thankless job most of the time. So I want to just kind of show some appreciation and salute those of you guys out there, you board members, who are volunteering your time, doing what you can to try and make life better for your communities. That's become especially complicated here in this last couple of years with all the legislative changes going on, the insurance market being as crazy as it is. This is a difficult time to be a board member. So I think you guys all deserve a pat on the back for sticking through it and trying to be those leaders in your communities. So thank you. All right, who are we? Our company is the oldest and largest reserve study provider in the United States. We've been in business since 1986. We've completed tens of thousands of reserve studies for all different types of properties all around the world. I think as of this week, I heard the number of 80,000. I think we crossed over 80,000 reserve studies this past year. Including myself, we have a total of 21 people on our Florida-based team, which represents a really wide variety of different backgrounds. We've got people with engineering degrees, architecture, construction management, but also business and accounting. As I mentioned, as of now, we've got 5 of us that have earned the RS credential and hopefully quite a few more that will be getting that soon. The majority of the work that we do is for community associations, which of course includes all types of condos, HOAs, timeshares, and other residential communities. But we also have a great deal of experience with other types of properties, things like office buildings, hotels, resort facilities, churches, synagogues, schools, and many more. We're very fortunate. We've been recognized by the Florida Community Association Journal as a Reader's Choice Award winner, actually for the last 11 years in a row now. So very proud of our staff and all the hard work that we do to keep that going every year. One thing I always like to point out is that our only job as a company is preparing reserve studies. Okay, so we are not an engineering firm. We're not an accounting firm. We are a specialized firm that focuses on doing this one thing really well, and that's to guide our clients towards a successful financial future. The way that we do that is by preparing accurate, reliable reserve studies that help those clients to forecast and budget for major projects. So we feel that if we do our job well, if we put out good reserve studies, and our clients follow the plans that we've helped design for them, hopefully they're able to reduce the risk of special assessments and bank loans and other types of financial distress. So in closing, if you'd like any additional information about us, you can visit our website. It's very easy, www.reservestudy.com. I'll have my email up on the screen towards the end today, and I think Ashley will be sending that out with all the follow-up email as well. But if you want to write that down now, it's wsimons, WSIMONS @reservestudy.com. Just as a plug, if you're interested in getting a proposal for a reserve study, that is something you can also do through our website. So without further ado, let's talk about today's course. Really just 2 sections to this course. The first one is going to focus on the philosophy, maybe the reasoning behind why reserves are important at all, right? So in other words, why is it not okay? It's not appropriate for an association to just pass special assessments or go out and borrow money every time they need to take on some major project. If you've been with our prior courses, I mean, we do a monthly webinar series. We've done a bunch of them with Campbell and other companies over the years, and some of you may have seen, we have another class called Fundamentals of Reserves. And that's a great, I would say, more introductory class where we talk about the statutes and really the building blocks of reserves and reserve studies. And in that course, I introduced a topic called percent funded, which is a very, very important concept or idea to understand when you talk about reserve studies. So if you're not sure what I mean by that, if that's the first time you've ever heard the term percent funded, I would really strongly suggest that you go back to a recording of one of those prior courses. I'd be happy to send a link to a recording if you need one. But that's a great starting point. Assuming that you may already be familiar with that, you do have a good handle on kind of the basics of reserves and reserve studies, I think you'll then have a better grasp on today's course, particularly the second part where we're going to go into a detailed overview of the 2 different methodologies, what we call the pooled method and then the straight line method. So first major question, why should you have reserves at all? Okay, and a way I like to frame this is to put it as kind of a hypothetical question. Now, I can't see you guys, I can't see your hands going up for one or the other, but ask yourself, what are reserves for? Or maybe more specifically, when are reserves for? Why do they collect them? And specifically, is that for the here and now, the present day, or do you collect reserves for the future? Okay, now let's think about that for a moment. Maybe ponder that, come up with your own answer, and yeah, let's see where we feel about that, what we feel about that. So if you, in your mind, were thinking that reserves are for the future, you're not alone. That's what most people would say. But I'm going to try to articulate this and make it a very critical point to explain that reserve funding should be thought of as being for the here and now. It's a present day. All right. So what do we mean by that? We think it's a misunderstanding to think of funding reserves as saving up for a future project. And the reason why we don't like that approach is because there's oftentimes a very good chance that the current owners, right, the people who live in a building now, won't be there at the time that future project takes place. So in their minds, they might think that, hey, it makes sense. I'm not going to be around to see this project come to fruition. So why should I put any money away for it, right? I'm not going to be around to benefit from that new thing, whatever that is. Now, I want everybody to think of this in a slightly different way. Instead of that, if you think of funding the reserves each year in the budget as paying the current bill of deterioration that is occurring in the present day, in the immediate fiscal year, that is more appropriately the way to think of it, kind of like a pay-as-you-go model. So let me give you a kind of a quick example on that. Let's say that I buy a unit in a brand new condo building, right? Just turned over from the developer, everything is brand new. Let's say the roof on that building is going to last for 20 years, right? Now, if I'm going to live there for the first, let's say 15 years of that building's existence, that means that I am enjoying 15 years of use and value and protection from that roof. Not to mention all of the other building components, right? The mechanical systems, the amenities, the hallways, the lobbies, all of that. Now, let's say after 15 years, I'm going to sell my unit and some new buyer is going to move in and he or she is going to live there for the next 15 years. All right, so zoom out. Remember that from the building's perspective, that roof has only got a few years left to go. It's soon going to be 20 years old. And that means that this second owner who's going to move in will be there for 5 years by the time that roof needs to be replaced. Now, here's where it gets a little tricky. Let's say that the whole time I lived there for those first 15 years, the association waived reserve funding. There was never any money put in the bank for eventually replacing that roof, right? Now, if that's the case, if there are no reserves, then it's very likely that when that roof finally fails a few years later, it's going to be paid for with a special assessment, right? Now, in this scenario, that new owner, the person who bought my unit, they're going to be charged with that special assessment, even though they've only lived there for 5 years or about a quarter of the roof's lifespan. But because they're paying the full amount of the replacement cost in that special assessment, they're paying their share, which is just the last few years of the roof's value, but also my share, even though I'm long gone, I moved away. So if you're wondering, well, who cares? So what? Well, think of that from the perspective of the second buyer, right? If you're deciding between a couple of buildings to move into, to buy into, it could be that the fact that my association, which doesn't have any reserve funds set aside, means that that would be a higher risk proposition for me to buy into that building. I'm more exposed to the risks of that happening, to more cost and a higher cost of living, a higher cost of ownership, right? A much greater chance that I'm going to have to pay that special assessment to bail out the building for all the years when they didn't collect reserves before, right? Now, that may be enough of a cause to have that second buyer choose another place to live or maybe pay less for that unit, right? So again, we make this point quite often to our clients that think of the decisions you make and the impact of those decisions from the perspective of a potential buyer, somebody who may want to join that association one day. What's the risk involved to them if there's an association that's not doing what it should be doing financially? And what choices might they make as a result? Okay, In our business, we like to talk about these kind of 4 cardinal reserve rules. The first is that these expenses are inevitable, right? There's no getting around the fact that air conditioning systems wear out and need to be replaced. Elevators need to be modernized. Fire alarm systems become obsolete, need to be modernized, right? Roads need to be repaved. Number 2, the board of directors is responsible. They are the ones who are entrusted with managing the community association on behalf of all their fellow owners. Number 3, when projects get delayed, they tend to get more expensive, right? And we see this all the time, especially in the case of things like roofs or concrete restoration, other building exterior components. The longer you let them go, the worse they get, right? And then the bottom line here, the fourth rule here is that the homeowners always get stuck paying that bill in one way or another, right? There is no Uncle Sam. There's no government bailout program for community associations that don't have adequate reserve funds. So just like there are these 4 rules for reserve planning, there are only 4 options for how to pay for these expenses. Now, the first and best option, we would argue, is to have that healthy reserve fund. Put money away, spread it out over time, earn interest on those funds. Every owner who comes and goes is paying their fair share, right? The second best option is to rely on special assessments when those projects come along. Now, it should be obvious, and we do this intentionally, it's not a good thing when your second best option has this skull and crossbones kind of warning on it. And if you've ever been the manager of a community, if you've been a resident, a board member in a community that has these ongoing recurring special assessments every time something needs to get done, hopefully you appreciate what I mean by that. It's a fairly toxic thing for a community to go through. The next best option after a special assessment would be to borrow some money, take out a loan, a line of credit to pay for these projects and then pay them back through the operating fund. Now, why would I have that ranked after a special assessment? Why is that worse? Well, it's because it's going to cost you more. You're financing part of it. And so you're going to pay some interest on that money. And then what happens if you don't do any of those, right? You don't have reserves, you can't pass a special assessment, and you're not able to borrow money. The only logical conclusion is your property falls apart, right? You don't have money to take care of it. It's going to start to decline in terms of property value. So that's when owners would really feel that when they go to try to sell their unit and find out it's not worth what it should have been. Okay, so kind of a lot to say on this slide. Here are some of the specific benefits of having these healthy reserve funds. So starting at the top, you shouldn't have any surprises, or hopefully at least a lower chance of getting caught by surprise when these projects come along. If you are funding your reserves appropriately, that means you're paying attention. You're tracking the life expectancies of these components. You're realizing what's getting near the end of its lifespan, and hopefully you're taking that seriously. You're coming up with some options to plan ahead and prepare for when that needs to be replaced, rather than getting caught by surprise and having to react when something fails unexpectedly. Okay. When you're planning ahead, hopefully that also gives you the chance to shop around, select from different providers, maybe get some deals going, right? Having that time on your side gives you the ability to seek out more bids, try to minimize the costs, working with your contractors, right? For example, maybe there's a time of the year when your painting company is a little bit slower and they can give you a little bit better price if they do it in some particular month, right? On the other hand, if you're calling out to these same vendors because it's an emergency and you got completely caught by surprise, your cooling tower failed and it's a 4th of July weekend, you're going to get stuck paying a much higher fee because it's an emergency at that point. You have to rush it, right? So be proactive, not reactive. That's kind of the main idea there. The point at the bottom of the slide here about minimizing exposure, I would say that's mostly relevant to you board members. What we mean here is that if you are proactively taking care of your property, you're doing a better job of upholding your fiduciary duty. That will give you better protection against any potential complaints, any claims, in the worst case, a lawsuit from the membership, right? You want to show that you are doing things to the best of your ability. You're observing the business judgment rule. You're acting in the best interest of the association, which is not always the same as the best interest of the people or the preferences of the people. Now, the last point to make here is that if you are doing all of these three things, hopefully that leads to increasing property values, right? In our experience, the communities that are doing a good job of reserve funding, they tend to have better curb appeal. They're more up to date with respect to their technology. They've been upgrading their amenities to stay current with newer properties. All of that contributes to a better ownership experience for the people who live there, which in turn makes them even more attractive to potential buyers. Remember the argument from a couple slides ago. Think of all of this from the perspective of a new person coming into your community. Okay, of course, we can say the opposites are true. If you don't have a healthy reserve fund, you are more exposed to surprises, which can lead to higher expenses, more liability exposure, and ultimately, because it's this vicious cycle, these declining property values can be a real problem. And the other issue is that when we see communities kind of get into this cycle, it becomes very difficult to break out of it, right? The longer you have waived reserves for however many years, the more of a shock to the financial system it's going to be to come up with a special assessment when these major projects start to come along. So, all right, that's the end of our first section there. We'll move on to part number 2, which is this, I think probably what a lot of you are here to learn about, the most important part, I think, the 2 ways that associations can actually calculate reserve funding. So here we are in January. I'm sure most of you have just recently adopted your budget for this year if you're on a calendar fiscal year. So some of this may be fresh in your minds, but first thing I'm going to do is go over this, what we call the straight line method. Now, the other term for this method is called the component method. And the reason for that is because in this approach, all of the individual components are treated separately from a funding standpoint. So we've always characterized this as kind of the old-fashioned way. More and more communities each year are switching to having pooled reserves. Part of the reason why it's, I think, the old-fashioned way is because prior to the year 2002, at least in the state of Florida, it was the only option. They did not allow pooling of reserves until 2002, even though it had been in place for many years elsewhere in the country prior to that. But the way I've often characterized this method is that it is simple in theory, but in reality, when you try to put it into practice, it becomes much more complicated, much more troublesome. So to understand the method, I think it's very helpful if you think of each category of reserve components as being handled in a kind of separate theoretical bucket, right? So for now, let's assume we're working with a community and we're talking about these 5 buckets when it comes to reserves. They've got their roof, their elevator, painting, mechanical, and pavement, okay? When you're using this method and you're putting together your budget, you're going to determine the amount of funding going into each of those separate buckets every year using a pretty simple calculation. Basically, what you do here is you take the cost of the component, you subtract out any existing funds, any money you've already saved for that component, and then you divide the difference by the remaining useful life of that thing, okay? The result of that calculation, excuse me, will then tell you the amount required to quote unquote fully fund that component in the following year's budget. Okay, so we'll do some math and use this as an example. Let's use our roof reserve or roof bucket, let's say, as our example. Now, if you understand the total volume of the bucket as representing the total cost of replacing that roof, and you look at your existing reserve money as the contents of the bucket, the empty portion up here could be considered what we would call the unfunded balance, right? It's just the difference between the cost of replacing the roof minus the money you've already got in the bank, okay? So if we put some numbers to it, let's say that the cost of replacing this roof is $200,000. At this point in time, there's $140,000 in our roof reserve fund. So the difference, 200 minus 140, is $60,000. That's our unfunded balance. In order for me to determine how much I therefore need to fund that roof reserve bucket going forward, I'm going to take that $200,000 cost, subtract out the 140 in existing cash. Whatever the difference is, I'm going to divide that by the remaining useful life of my roof. How many more years has it got to go? So let's say that for argument's sake, we've determined that's 3 years. Okay. I'm going to take 200 minus 140. I get 60,000 divided by 3 means I am going to put away 20 grand a year into my roof reserve bucket so that I will be fully funded for it by the time it fails. Okay. In order to proceed, I'm going to continue that process with each of the remaining buckets, right? And each one will be a separate calculation. They all have different levels of funding. They all have different costs, different timelines, but I'm going to do something like that individual calculation for each one. Now, in reality, what happens over time is that you end up with a variety of different funding positions, right? That depends on how accurate your assumptions were for your life expectancies and your costs. In the end, what it means is that some accounts might be very well funded while others are behind. They're not. Now, in our view, this sort of portrayal is a very inefficient distribution of all of the association's actual reserve cash, right? You can have money that's locked up in one place when it would be really advantageous to move it over and pay for some other project that's a higher priority. That starts to make things very complicated, right? Just in this scenario on the screen, let's say we've got a ton of money sitting in our pavement account and maybe half of what we need for our elevators. Now, what's more important to a high-rise building, the parking lot or the elevators, right? Obviously the elevators. You cannot live in a high-rise building without a working elevator. If you drive over cracked pavement as you park your car, so what, right? So it would be nice to take some of this pavement reserve money, move it over to our elevator project if that's coming up and we need to take care of it. Okay, some of the additional problems we find with this method, first of all, it's very often the case that something's been overlooked, right? There is no bucket, there is no reserve fund that's been established for some important component, something like concrete restoration, let's say. Or the funds might be too broadly defined, right? So for example, we sometimes see on a client's balance sheet that they have one straight line account that's just called mechanical. And in theory, that's supposed to capture everything from their security cameras to the fire alarms to the cooling tower up on the roof. Problem is that all of those have very different life expectancies and very different costs. And if they're just lumped together into this one broad category, how are we going to have to do some math to figure out how much in total needs to go into that account? It is possible, but it's quickly going to become a headache for whoever's going to try to do that. Okay, from a management standpoint, again, this method is much more challenging. The reason for that is that the Florida statutes require that the owners would have to vote and approve the moving of funds from one place to another. So in my example on the last slide, moving money from the parking lot reserves to the elevator fund, that would require getting a quorum and passing a vote to make that happen. And we all, I think, probably know that getting a quorum, passing a vote for anything in a condo especially, is a difficult task, especially so when it comes to moving money around. Your residents might be very skeptical of the board. They might be hesitant to give that approval unless they fully understand the situation. And that means maybe the board, the manager have to call special meetings, get emails out, get postings up, get the attorneys involved, all that sort of thing. Lastly, and I think probably the most serious problem with this method is that because it is more conservative, associations are not making the most efficient use of the sum total of all of their available cash. And the result of that is that it ends up costing the owners in these associations much more money each year to properly fund their reserve account. So just to give you guys a quick story on that, at the end of each year, we look back at all of the studies we've produced and we look at the funding recommendations for our clients that are using the straight line method. And then we look at what happens if we did the same exact study, but using the pooled method, right? We give them both recommendations. We'll show if you stick with this method, here's what it looks like. If you were to pool your reserves, which we'll talk about in a moment, here's the difference. And very reliably whenever we do this, and again, this is using a sample size of hundreds of reserve studies, we found that the average difference is about 200%. Okay, so I'll repeat that. That means on average, the exact same building, the exact same association would have to spend triple the amount of funding in reserves using the straight line method than if they were to pool their reserves. Okay, sometimes it's more dramatic than that even. There was a case years ago where we had a client that could save $1 million a year by pooling their reserves instead of sticking with the same straight line approach that they had. So it does happen. Now, I always like to point out, given that pretty much every association we've ever worked with, and I'm sure that's true for most everybody on the call, is trying to cut their costs, keep their assessments as low as they can. One of the easiest ways you can accomplish that, if you have straight line reserves now, is to look into pooling those reserves together. More and more associations are making that switch each year and typically never looking back. All right, so let's talk about that. This better option on the table, which is called the pooled method. This is also known as the cash flow method, and I'm not going to be shy about it. This is absolutely the better way to go. Just for background, this method has only been approved in Florida since 2002. But I mentioned earlier, our company's been around since the 80s, and I can tell you for certain that outside of Florida, this method has been in use much earlier than that and is basically universal. Okay, we have over a dozen offices throughout the US. Our Florida office is the only one that has any clients that I'm aware of using the straight line method. Everybody switched to pooled forever ago. And I would highly encourage you guys to do the same if you haven't done that yet. So to contrast this from the straight line method, I would say arguably the pooled method is somewhat more complex in theory, but once you get the hang of it, I think it's actually a lot easier to use for working with your annual budget. All right, because this question comes up all the time, I just thought, let's put a slide in here and talk about the process. If you wanted to switch from straight line reserves to pooled, how do you do that? Well, first and foremost, to be clear, the board of directors can create a new pooled reserve account all by itself. So what that means is the board could say, for example, as of next fiscal year, all of our new incoming reserve money that we collect is going to go into this new pool of funds that we've created. Okay, that itself does not require the owners to vote. However, if the board wants to move money from the existing straight line accounts into the new pooled fund, right? Money that was collected in prior years that they want to put into the pool, that is when the owners would have to vote and approve it, okay? Basically the same idea as moving funds from one straight line account to another. The state views it as what's called a non-scheduled use of those reserve funds. So the same voting process is required as if you were moving money from, painting to elevator reserves, for example. Good news is that this is a one-time process. You do not have to do it every year when you adopt your budget. Once you switch to pooled reserves, it's done. If you're nervous about that process, if you want to get some third-party guidance, I definitely think it's a good idea to work with your CPA. Maybe you talk to your attorney. If you have a reserve study provider, they can certainly help you. Make sure you go through the process correctly. But once you've done that, I think you will enjoy that pooled reserves is much more advantageous than straight line. Okay. So just to articulate what it is, the best way that I found to explain this method is to go back to that same sort of bucket analogy that I used when I was talking about straight line. Okay. But just imagine now that I'm going to take all of those old buckets of money that I had, and I'm going to dump them into one big bathtub, okay? All of the money that was in all these separate places is now in one place, okay? And in the course of doing that, we've removed the labels from any specific categories of reserve funds. Now, all of it is just reserve money, and it is collectively available for any component on their reserve schedule. So in other words, there is no such thing anymore as a roof reserve dollar or a painting dollar or an elevator dollar. It is all reserve money that can be spent much more effectively and much more efficiently. Now, again, this does not mean it's a slush fund. You cannot spend pooled reserve funds on throwing the world's greatest New Year's Eve party or taking on some capital improvement or something that is not otherwise defined as a reserve component. Still limited just to those same things you were looking at before, but in a much more effective manner. All right, so I'm going to talk you through the process of how you would develop your reserve budget and come up with these funding amounts. But the very first step of the process is the same no matter whether you're doing straight line or pooled. And that is to have a solid foundation. A good reserve plan is only as good as the accuracy of its component list, right? What are you reserving for? How good are your estimates for life expectancy and cost? It doesn't matter which method you're using if those figures are not reliable, okay? So assuming you've done that, whether that's with a third-party reserve study provider or internally or some combination of the two, once you have that list of reserve components, all of the life expectancies and costs that go with them, what you can then do is look forward in time and design a timeline of future expenses. Okay, so it might look something like this. Most reserve studies will include typically a 30-year forecast, and we show roughly what's going to happen, which components are expiring in each year and what do they cost. Let's add all those up together. So you see there's a lot of volatility here. There's some years, many years, where there's no reserve spending at all. Some years where there's a huge amount, some where there's hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands. But the point is it's not an even consistent year over year plan. There's a lot of variety here. Okay, once we have something like that timeline, once you know what those future expenditures should look like, the next step in the process is to determine how much money we need to put into this pool in order to pay for those expenses, right? It's a pretty straightforward process, but I'll walk you through the steps here. The first thing to do, step one, is to determine the sum total of your reserve funds at the start of the fiscal year. How much money is in the pool, okay? The next step is to plug in an amount for estimated income to that account, which can be a combination of your contributions, right? What you collect from the owners and transfer to reserves, but also interest earnings, okay? So notice again here, another advantage over the straight line method. Because the straight line method does not model anything beyond the first year, you really can't factor in much in terms of interest earnings to your overall income assumption, okay? The next step is to go back to that forecast of expenses and look at what costs are on the schedule for the next year. From there, you're just going to do the math. How much cash are you starting with? How much are you going to add? How much will you subtract? And where does that leave the pool of funds going into year two? Okay, when you look at the start of year two, obviously you have to make sure that you still have some money in the bank. If not, then you need to go back to step one, plug in a higher contribution rate for that first year, because we're never allowed to design a plan that would have you going below zero. Right, we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the beauty of doing this process, this modeling of cash in and cash out on an annual basis, is that it's very easy to do with an Excel spreadsheet or a third-party software. You can run a scenario going out 30 years very quickly just by setting up some formulas that show, as cash goes in and cash goes out, where that leaves you at the start of each fiscal year. Okay, all you've got to do then is figure out how much money you need to contribute over those years to keep that account balance at a safe level. Okay, what do we mean by safe? There's differences of opinion here about what should be left in reserves at the end of any given fiscal year. And the way that those are discussed is in these three different funding objectives, what we call baseline funding, full funding, and threshold funding. And I'll talk about each one of those kind of in that order. So the first possible objective, the first option on the table is what we call baseline funding. Now, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. This is the riskiest thing you can do. It is perfectly legal, but for most communities out there, this is not a good idea. Basically, the objective here is that you're going to figure out what is the bare minimum amount of money that I need to be putting into reserves each year going forward to stay above zero, right? So whether I'm looking out 20 years, 30 years, as cash goes in and cash goes out, at minimum, we have to stay with a positive number at the end of each year. Now, I want to make this next part very clear. When we talk with managers and accountants and board members, I think there's a very common disconnect in the terminology. Okay? The problem here is that if you talk to most people in Florida, and I don't think this is their fault, really, it's just our industry has not done a good job of communicating this. If you ask people what they mean by fully funding a pooled reserve account, what they will describe to you is what I am now telling you is actually called baseline funding. It is the minimum required by law unless you get a vote of your owners to approve something less than that. And basically that's, what a lot of people want to know at budget time. What's the amount of money that we need to put into reserves each year so that we don't have to get our owners to vote and approve it? And the law in Florida says that that amount, that number that needs to be put in the budget to avoid having any votes, is the amount that would be required to keep some positive cash balance and reserves each year. And anything above zero is acceptable. Okay, this is the actual language that you see in the Florida legislation when they talk about pooled reserves. Basically says that your contribution rate needs to be enough so that over time, your cash inflows are greater than your cash outflows over the period of time, but that's it. There's no other requirement to go along with it. And if you take the time to read closer into the legislation, the term fully funding is not used anywhere with respect to the pooled method. The closest thing we can find is the term sufficient funds. And to go even further, the DBPR, the Department of Business and Professional Regulation, has a manual that they have published, which is a guide very commonly used by managers and board members that talks about pooled reserves and how to design this funding plan. In the example used in that manual, which you can download on the internet for free, the sample association that they're talking about gets to a point where they have $4, not 40, not 40,000, where they have $4 in the reserve account, and that is described as being sufficient. So before I say anything else, just a rhetorical question out there. Does anybody think, whether you're a board member, manager, or somebody else, would you ever think that it's a good idea for any association to have $4 in its reserve account? We obviously don't think so. I hope you would recognize that's a very dangerous approach to take. Obviously, if you are doing the bare minimum like that, it only takes one problem to completely ruin the plan. That can be a project that happens a little earlier than you anticipated, or that costs a little bit more than you thought it would. The point is, if you're trying to thread the needle that closely, scraping the barrel to the point where you have a couple bucks left in your reserve account, there's no margin for error. Okay. And in that scenario, the chances that you will need special assessments or loans are very, very high. So if, again, one of our whole reasons of doing this in the first place is to try to reduce that risk, I would argue that baseline funding is not a viable strategy for you. Okay, this is what it looks like in reality. This is a real world example of what baseline funding would look like. I took this as kind of a screenshot from one of our studies. So if you look at the top left corner here, you're going to see this first column represents the 30 years of the plan, right? Moving from left to right, you see the different financial figures that correspond to each of those fiscal years, right? You've got your starting reserve balance, the fully funded reserve balance as of that year, which is then determined to calculate percent funded. Hopefully, if you're comfortable with this topic, you understand what percent funded means and that it translates into different levels of risk that can be low, medium, or high. But assuming you've got a handle on that, we're moving to the right now. This is the cash flow. How much is going into reserves? Are there any loans or special assessments considered? How much can you earn in interest? How much are you going to spend? So basically from left to right, you're going to say starting reserve balance plus reserve funding plus interest income minus reserve expenses will give you the starting balance for the next year. So with a spreadsheet like this, you can run out a projection that shows how much is going to be spent, presumably how much you will collect and where that leaves you. right? Now, in this scenario where we're doing baseline funding, the goal of this plan is to try to get this starting balance as close to zero as possible without going below. That will produce the lowest amount of reserve funding needed in this association. So just a couple things to point out here. We're starting at a strong position. This community has over $1 million in reserves. They're about 90% funded. That's a great place to be. But if they're not funding adequately over time, that position of strength erodes very quickly, right? They get down to a point where at some point in the future, about 10 years from now, they've got 2.2 million to spend and not very much in reserves to begin with. They're going to not waste, but spend almost all of their money at that point and just barely get by. And they never really recover, right? They were in a strong position. They get dangerously close to zero, and they never climb back out of that hole to the point where they were. Okay, now again, the state of Florida would call this sufficient. The owners in this community would not have to vote and approve this plan. It's only if they wanted to do less than this that would clearly send them below zero. That's when the owners have to vote on it. Okay, we've talked about the minimum requirement. I'm now going to switch to the other end of the spectrum and talk about the most conservative option, which is called full funding or fully funding the reserves. And I'm going to be very careful here. I'm using the term full funding in the context of pooled reserves, using the definition that comes from National Reserve Study standards. Okay, and as I said before, most people in Florida have a concept of fully funding, what they think it means, which is what I just showed you. What we now know is actually baseline, but full funding from a national standpoint means setting your reserve funding goal to attain and maintain reserves at or near 100% funded. Okay, that's why it's so important that we have to understand this concept. And this is what the CAI adopted these National Reserve Study standards back in 1998, 4 years prior to when pooled reserves became allowed in Florida. I wish I could have been in the room back then to point out that there was existing terminology. Let's be consistent with that. There's no need to reinvent the wheel here, but this is where things stand at present. So how does that look, right? We can use the same example as before, but in this case, the goal of the funding plan is not baseline funding. It's not to get close to zero, but to try to reach 100%, to attain and maintain that position. And you see very clearly that's what they do. Very important to point out, the reserve expenses in this idea, this example, are the exact same as what they were on the prior slide. The starting balance is the same. The only difference is what goal they have set for themselves. So in this scenario, it is a higher amount of funding, but never gets them into any dangerous position. At the least, they would still have hundreds of thousands of dollars in the bank when these big projects come along. Okay. Another way to look at this is using this kind of comparison. Here, I'm looking at percent funded on this left-hand vertical axis. On the bottom from left to right, we've got time, right? The different colored dots along the way represent those different percent funded levels based on different objectives. So the recommended green funding plan here is fully funding, attain and maintain 100%. The kind of orange color here, labeled as the alternate, is the baseline funding plan. You see it limps along, not so bad for the first 10 years or so, but then it falls off a cliff. And then we've got this series of purple dots, which in this case is just showing the client what happens if they don't change anything at all. Their current budget for reserve is even less. They will definitely run out of money. Okay. So people will often ask, what does this mean in terms of cost, right? Now, the baseline funding plan in this example required $102,400 in contributions in year one. The full funding plan called for $127,500. It's a difference of about 25%. Okay. Now, I will tell you that's actually a more sizable difference than we usually see. Most of the time, the net difference between baseline and full funding is something like 15 to 20%. Okay. It's not double, it's not triple, it's not 10 times the amount of money to fully fund compared to baseline. It's a little bit more. Now, in this real world scenario, I can tell you the difference there between baseline and full funding came down to $15 per unit per month. Okay. Think about that. That's less than $1 a day per unit. meant the difference between doing the riskiest possible thing and the safest, most responsible thing that would produce the lowest risk of special assessments in the future. And keep in mind, the current plan, sticking with the status quo, doing what they had been doing, will not work at all. So we basically just leave that there to show the client, look, you have to increase your reserve funding no matter what. But while you're at it, let's show you how to do it in the most responsible, most effective way possible. Okay, just a few more slides here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this last option because I think it's fairly simple to understand. Basically, threshold funding means any objective between baseline and full, right? So in this scenario, you pick a target and then you design your funding plan accordingly. So for example, you could say, instead of getting to 100% funded, we want to aim for 70%, right? How much money will that take us to get there? Another way they could look at it is, we want to make sure that we never drop below $1 million in our pooled reserve fund. That's our floor we're going to set for ourselves. And then you just do the math, right? You run the scenarios, you run the model, and you see how much it would take to achieve whatever that goal is. The problem with this approach, as I see it, is it's a lot more subjective, right? For example, let's say you have one group of board members in one fiscal year who say, we think 50% funded is a good threshold. And then they get voted out. And the next year, a different board is in place and they say, no, the threshold should be 20%. That's going to have a wild swing on the amount of money going into reserves each year and a wild swing on the risk involved with that. Sometimes we'll do these, or it's kind of a unique scenario. We'll design for a client based on their input, just as a theoretical idea. But as we talked about on the last slide, it usually just makes a lot more sense to fully fund, right? To go for 100%, especially because it's gradual. It's getting there over 30 years. We're never telling a client you have to become 100% funded right away. That's usually going to be much more advantageous than picking some arbitrary threshold. Okay, I see the Q&A list is already at a daunting 66 questions, so I'm going to try to wrap this up and open that up. And Ashley, if you want to maybe start screening through those questions and help me out there, that would be great. But before we do, I want to leave you with a few kind of parting thoughts. Hopefully everybody agrees by now, reserves are incredibly important for associations in the present and then by extension in the future. But you don't get to the future unless you make good choices in the present, right? When you're designing your annual budget, we would encourage you to think hard, choose wisely about which method you're going to use to do that, right? Hopefully that means you're pooling your reserves. Once you've chosen that method, then make another smart choice about what the objective of your funding plan should be. I would say that, baseline funding is better than nothing at all, but for a little bit more money, you can really set your community up on a path to greater financial success. Okay. When you're working on the budget each year, the goal is not to keep the dues low and keep the members happy, right? As a leader in the industry, in the community, whether you're a reserve specialist, a property manager, or just a board member, a volunteer serving your community, it is our collective responsibility to educate the people that we're working with and to help them make wise financial decisions. So, all right, a little under an hour. We will open this up to Q&A. And I don't know, Ashley, if you've already started to look through these. I can
I did. I went through like any of the housekeeping ones I responded to. So this is just, I've been doing that periodically. So this is just people with other questions.
All right, guys, I'm going to do my best. I can stay on till about 1:30. And I guess I'll just preface this by saying a couple things. First of all, I'm not an attorney. So any of these that might be legal questions, I can't help you. I legally cannot give you legal advice. So I would try to avoid anything that's interpreting governing documents or statutes. The other thing is I've not seen these questions before. So I'm going to do my best to answer them on the fly. If some of the questions are redundant or if I've covered it during the class or somebody else has already asked it, I'll probably skip over that. I'm going to try to focus on the questions that are the most relevant to the most amount of people. So if there's something very unique and specific about your individual situation, or if I wouldn't possibly be able to answer that without having worked with you in more detail, we'll probably have to skip that for the good of the group. But with that said, I will do my best. So let's dive right in. All right. I'm just going from the top, and we'll try to do my best to answer these live. And here we go. If not already included in the presentation, could you please address how you propose is the best way to accumulate funds to cover ever-increasing sizes of property insurance deductibles? Yeah, great question there. So we would tell you that reserves are not the best way to fund an insurance deductible. And the reason for that is because they are unpredictable. One of the hallmarks of reserve planning is that you have to have some sense of predictability and frequency to properly budget for something, right? If I don't know how often a deductible is going to be paid, it could be next year, it could be 10 years from now, it could be 3 times in the next 7 years. If I'm assigning a useful life to that and putting money away based on that assumption, which is really not based on anything but a guess, the chances are very likely my calculations are wrong, and I will end up pulling money away from other reserve components that do have a predictable nature to them as a result. So, you know, it's a reality in Florida. We're always going to have more storms coming. But I would encourage everyone to maybe think of like an emergency line of credit or a separate emergency savings fund. Put money aside that way, and that's how you can deal with your deductible. I would not treat that as a reserve component like you would a roof or a paint job or a parking lot or anything like that. Okay, will you be touching on the recent legislation changes with regard to mandatory reserve funding for larger buildings? And do you have any insights as to potential changes this year? I knew this question was going to come up, and I will talk as much as I can about Senate Bill 154, which is the major piece of legislation that got passed last year. So just to do a quick summary of that, Senate Bill 154 was passed as very much a response to the Champlain Towers collapse that killed 98 people and resulted in $1 billion legal claim, just the biggest tragedy in, at least in recent memory in Florida history that I'm aware of. So we all know what happened there. The government responded with this legislation to require some new things for certain types of buildings. So it is limited to condos and co-ops that are 3 stories and above, all throughout the state, have to do a couple new things. One is called a milestone inspection. And what that is a requirement for a building when it hits its 30th year after its certificate of occupancy date, and then every 10 years thereafter. And the milestone inspection is basically just a structural evaluation done by an engineer or architect, looking at the condition of the property and recommending any immediate fixes. That can be done as what's called a phase 1 inspection, which is visual only. If they don't discover anything in the visual inspection that looks bad, then that's it. If they do, it goes to a phase 2 inspection, which is much more intense, could involve destructive testing, different diagnostic methods, and that's a much more of a comprehensive project. So that's very much an expansion of the 40-year certification requirements that have been in place in Dade and Broward for a long time. The other thing is a structural integrity reserve study, and that's on another new requirement, applies to the same types of properties, 3 stories and up, nothing for HOAs at this point. So if you're with an HOA, you can go grab a cup of coffee. But for condos and co-ops, 3 stories and above, those are the 2 new things. The structural integrity reserve study is very much like a traditional reserve study, except that when we do a financial analysis, we have to look at some specific elements of the building and prepare a separate funding schedule for those. And those things will not be able to be waived or partially funded within the next year or 2. So that's going to be roofing, structure, painting and waterproofing, plumbing, electrical, fire protection, windows and doors, and I might be missing one there, and basically anything else over $10,000, which if neglected could compromise something else on the list. So if your structure can be compromised by balconies that are not waterproofed, or planters on a pool deck above a parking garage that are leaking, those would now be considered structural components, and the membership of the association has no choice but to fund those. So I have a whole separate webinar on that. It's probably 45 minutes or so. I'd be happy to send that out to people. You can find it on our company's YouTube channel. I do a much deeper dive into the requirements, but the second part of the question here, do I have any insights as to potential changes? From my understanding, I don't think there's going to be anything revolutionary in any changes this year. I think there's some fine tuning, some changing of language. I have not heard anything conclusive about extending deadlines or anything like that. So if you're in a building, if you're in a community that is subject to these requirements, I would act as if they are due at the end of the year, which they are. It's December 31st, 2024 is the deadline. So I know that's not a very thorough answer. I'm sure there's more questions that will come up in the list. I'm going to try to leave it at that with regard to the new legislation. But I would certainly encourage you guys to seek out more opinions on that. Like I said, we've got a whole nother webinar that we've recorded that talks about that. So hopefully that was good enough for now. Let's see, we had a study done a few years ago and we'll be doing it again for CERS. Is it better to remain with the original reserve study company? I would say so. Yeah, if you're comfortable that the study done a few years ago was well done and you had a good relationship, good experience with that provider, there's probably some cost savings to be had if you're using the same provider. They already know the building, they know what you have there. So hopefully that would be a little bit of a better price point, but that assumes you had a good experience working with the prior one. Okay, please make sure you address strategies for dealing with inflation. Thanks. Yeah, that's a big topic in the last couple of years. The general, inflationary environment in the U.S. has been pretty dramatic, as we know. Things hopefully are cooling down and calming down a little bit, but costs are still much higher than they used to be. So what that means is if you have not been using more current estimates with your reserve budgeting at the end of the year, it's time to readdress that, right? If you paid $100,000 for something in 2019, the chances are very good it would not be $100,000 again today. It might be 125. All right. So talk to your vendors, try to get current cost estimates for things, work with your reserve study provider. That's a huge part of what we do, is try to stay current with the going market rates for things. We are adapting everything on the fly to the current data as we see it. So if a spike in air conditioning pricing is become prevalent, we're going to start using those newer price points in our studies. That's what we do. I think you guys as associations should be doing something similar. Basically just making sure you're always using the latest and greatest information. Now, there's another way to talk about inflation, which is on the contributions to reserves as well. You should absolutely expect that your contributions to reserves and in turn, really your overall budget should go up a little bit each year, right? It's pretty standard that, utility costs go up, payroll, obviously insurance, everything gets a little bit more expensive each year. And so if you have not raised your dues in 10 years, to me, that's usually a red flag that you've been cutting costs somewhere, and most often it's in the reserve account, right? So again, inflation, very complicated topic these days. That's some of the things that we're doing, but really it's just a matter of trying to stay as current as possible with market pricing. All right, let's see. To confirm, your company also has Florida licensed engineers that you work with to complete a CERS. Yes, we do have a structural engineer who is a PE that we hired last year. He is directly involved with reviewing work, with doing inspections. So we do have one on staff. We've got a bunch of other relationships with other engineering firms out there. We're happy to work with clients that have already engaged a PE to do their milestone inspection, for example. Yes, we will happily work with anybody, but we do have that capability on our staff as well. One of the things I should point out, though, is that you don't have to be a PE any longer to do a structural integrity reserve study. The law, part of the amendment to the law last year, was that they expanded that pool of providers to include not only engineers and architects, but also reserve specialists and professional reserve analysts. So we don't necessarily have to work with an engineer, but we very often do. Okay, yeah, link to the prior course talking about percent funded. I'm happy to send that out. Ashley, maybe I'll just give you the link to that and we can send that with our follow-up email.
Yep, that's great.
Let's see. Okay, a bunch of people asking for that. Okay, here we go. I am VP of my condo board. Not sure if you can answer this, but I felt it's somewhat on topic. Um, some board members are interested in taking out a line of credit because of the uncertainty regarding finances and reserves in the future. They're hearing that other associations are doing this. Being a retired licensed title agent, I'm opposed to this when we have no need for an open line of credit. What are your thoughts? I think it's a good idea. I think, the example I gave earlier about paying an insurance deductible or some other surprise expense for the association. I think if you have a line of credit available to you and you're disciplined about not abusing it, that's a good thing. Inevitably there will be a hurricane, let's say, or some other catastrophe, and there will be a need for a lot of money very quickly. And you don't want to be, 1,000 associations in line at the bank all trying to get one at the same time. I think that getting proactive and securing that line of credit and putting some controls around when it could be used and for what purposes is a good thing. Because eventually, even if it's just to cover a shortfall in the budget one year, some other surprise expense, I don't think that's a bad idea. All right, 2 questions. How are reserve study costs calculated for a condo association? And then secondly, if an association does a reserve study, must they implement the results for legal reasons? Okay, so the first question, how do we come up with a cost for a reserve study? It's based on a number of factors, and I think any provider would tell you this. It's the location of the building, the size, the age, the architecture, the number of amenities. Basically comes down to time. How complicated is this place? How long is it going to take us to get there and back? What are we going to find when we get there? Is it a very old property that we're going to have to do a lot of research and a lot of homework to get answers for things? All of that matters. The time of year matters, right? Summer and fall is busy season, so waiting until then is usually going to mean a little bit more of a price point for a reserve study than doing it, in the late part of the year or early part of the year, kind of before or after budget season. Secondly, if the association does a study, do they have to implement the results? So traditionally, I would say no, but that is now changing with regard to the structural integrity reserve study requirements. So for the SIRS specifically, the law does now state that the proposed funding of reserves for those components addressed must be based on the most recent structural integrity reserve study. So that does have a mandate. Otherwise, historically, they don't. So if you're in an HOA or if you're in a low-rise condo that's not a SIRS candidate, you do have some discretion. It is professional advice. Maybe an attorney could make an argument that ignoring the advice of an expert is not a good thing to do, but traditionally they have been voluntary exercises that you can use however you like. The exception now being the SIRS requirements. All right, you guys keep asking and I keep trying to answer as fast as I can. I apologize for anybody that I'm going to miss. So I might start skipping over a couple of these. Let's see. Okay, we have a reserve for paving. If there are ancillary items needed to support the paving, such as removing and reinstalling mailboxes because they're at their edge of the driveway pavement and cutting down trees in which the roots have buckled the pavement, can those things be paid using the reserve funds for paving? It's a good question. To me, I think anything that is intrinsic to the process of getting the pavement work done could be lumped in as one project. You could throw in even professional services, right? So we have a lot of clients that are remodeling lobbies and spending a lot of money doing it and hiring interior designers or decorators to assist with that project. To me, that's all part of the same scope of what they're doing. So, same goes if you're hiring an engineer to oversee a concrete restoration project. The professional fees for their services can be lumped in as part of the overall concrete restoration job. So if you're having to take out mailboxes in order to do this pavement work and put them back, I think that's a reasonable use of those funds. But anything can be a case-by-case basis. If you're not sure, I would always ask your attorney, get their opinion. But to me, if it is part and parcel with getting the work done, and especially if that's going to happen again in the future, you should reflect that in your reserve study. Okay. Some of these are kind of calling back to specific studies, specific slides in the presentation. I'm going to try to move through those. You can always go back and watch the recording, and we'll be sending the copies of the slides as well. Please tell us at the end when the SIR study is required. First one is by the end of this year, unless the legislators produce some new schedule in this session, which is ongoing right now. Until something changes, it's the end of this year. Let's see. This is more of a comment, but I think it's worth repeating. If a property does not properly reserve, sellers may be limited to cash buyers because the property may not be eligible for traditional lending. That is definitely a trend we are seeing increase. Banks and lenders and even government entities, government related entities, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, are all paying a lot more attention to reserves now and looking negatively at buildings that do not have money in the bank, because if they're going to give a mortgage to somebody who's going to move into a property, especially if it's like an FHA mortgage, a low down payment situation, if that building doesn't have money in the bank, the higher chances that that person's going to get hit with a special assessment may impact their ability to pay their mortgage. So that is why lenders are caring about this. They're viewing it as a risk, just a risk profile. So if they can limit or manage their risk of lending money to people by restricting the types of properties they can buy into, that makes sense. They would do that. So yes, I think that's a very, very real effect of some of the changes we've seen in the last few years. Okay, this is an interesting question. How can an association change from pooled reserves to straight line? Will this be a board decision or a membership decision? I've honestly never seen it done. I can't recall a time off the top of my head where a community has gone from pooled back to straight line. I don't know the answer to that, if that would be a board decision or if there's any vote required, because in theory, you're moving money from one reserve account to another. So maybe there is a vote to do that, but that's a great question for an attorney. I've never seen that done. All right, let's see. If we adopt a pooled reserve method, can we place a dollar or percent limit on the amount that can be spent on a single project? Right. So I think what's really being asked here is, can we build in some controls and some restrictions in our pooled reserve fund? Because people will sometimes think that this creates a opportunity for board members to spend recklessly, right? To spend all of the money in the pool on something that they shouldn't. In theory, I suppose one way you could do that is to put something in your governing documents that says, any amount to be spent from the pooled reserve, let's say if it exceeds the amount listed on your reserve study by a certain percentage, right? It's something is much more expensive than you anticipated. Maybe that has to be voted upon, right? Quick example, let's say you have a reserve study done and they put in $50,000 for remodeling the lobby, right? Based on what it is now. And you've got a board full of, not to cast any aspersions on anybody, let's say a bunch of interior designers who want to run wild and spend $1 million on the lobby. That would be a pretty egregious use of those funds, I think. I think that's opens them up to criticism from a fiduciary duty standpoint. That, is that acting in the best interest of the community? I would say probably not, unless they have a ton of money in the bank. So there are some stopgaps and some controls that you can put in there. Again, better question for an attorney, but usually you don't want to do that. Usually you want to make sure that the reserve funds are as effective as they can be, which means typically not limiting them by some specific criteria. Straight line method would be each component in a separate account, yes, or groups of similar components, right? So you might have one roof reserve account or roof reserve bucket, which covers tile roof and flat roofs and a guardhouse roof. It's all roofing. Might be three different components because they have three different lifespans, but they're all factored within one account. Okay, let's see. Putting on your owner's hat, what is the practical and suggested frequency for updating reserve studies? Recognizing SIRS are mandated at 10 years. Is there a difference in cost to update a reserve study, or is it treated as a new study? The long-standing best practice in the industry is about every 3 years. So about every 3 years to have an on-site evaluation done is the gold standard. That's the way it's legislated in other places. If I was giving somebody advice, I would say it's every 3 years. Every year is probably overkill, especially if you're talking about doing an on-site visit every year. Every 10 is way too long, right? And we've said this to the state that if you're going to tell people they have to do something, but only do it once every 10 years, the problem you'll run into is the changes in the marketplace will be dramatic by then, right? If I was working with a community today, right, that has been working off a reserve study they last did in 2014, just think of all the changes in the economy, just the hurricanes we've had since then, all the things that have changed that might affect their component list. If they had not been diligently doing updates on their own to account for that, they can be really far off course. And so, every 2 to 3 years, certainly no longer than 5 years is when you should be doing a formal reserve study. Now, an update should be less costly than the first one, right? The first reserve study you ever do is always going to be most expensive because there's a lot to do, right? Taking measurements, photos, building everything from scratch. Going back to that same property a few years later should be, 2/3 the cost, of half the cost maybe of doing the original full study. So it should be less expensive in the future. Let's see. Okay, I've got about maybe 13, 14 minutes here. Going to try to look for some that I think are relevant to many people. Here we go. Okay, this is a common question. Our management company told us that we cannot pool any longer due to the changes in the 2024 legislature. Please confirm their info is not correct. There's well, no, that's not correct. Okay, I'll be clear. The pooled method is still permitted in Florida. It is. If anything, what you might now have to do is have two pools of funds. Okay, one pool for your structural components, one pool for everything else that still meets the criteria under the law. It does not require that you have straight line reserves for all the SIRS items. You do not need to have a roof reserve, a structure, a painting, a plumbing, electrical, and everything else. That can be a pool of funds unto itself, and that pool can be spent on anything within that list. You can still have a separate pool of funds for elevators, air conditioning, swimming pool, parking lot, lobbies, all the other stuff in the association. That's how we're doing our studies. I have spoken with the head of the DBPR about this. There is absolutely no mandate that you have to go to straight line. So yeah, I see a bunch of people asking that question. Hopefully that covers it. Let's see. Can I address how to set up the SIRS reserve account, or is that another webinar? Yeah, it would be kind of a longer topic. Basically, we'd start with the SIRS requirements, go through those things, create a separate component schedule of those. And then if we're working with a client that has one pool of funds now that needs to allocate some money to that separate pooled SIRS account, the way we would do that is by looking at the underlying costs and life expectancies of the SIRS components, prioritizing that. So taking as much money from the single pooled fund as we could, putting it towards the SIRS items first, then whatever's left over may be available for your other components. It can get more complicated than that, particularly if you have some major project on the other side that's coming up soon, something like an elevator modernization. Then it might be more advantageous to leave some money for that and worry about the SIRS things later. But that's a kind of a case-by-case basis. Okay. Yes, pooled is allowed. A lot of people asking that question. Is pavement a requirement for Florida statutes? Yes. So talking about condos and co-ops specifically, statute 718 and 719 still has its existing language. It says associations must budget for roofing, painting, pavement resurfacing, and anything else over $10,000. So that is kind of the baseline law for everybody. Then if you're 3 stories and above, they have that subset of SERS things, which are now needing to be done separately. So yeah, pavement is still on the list for everybody though, at least for condos and co-ops. Okay. Can pooled reserve funds be transferred to the operating budget? I would say no. Legally speaking, I believe they can. In certain situations, if your owners vote to approve it, you can use reserve money for just about anything. Should you do that? No. If you're having a shortfall in your operating budget, that is when you probably would lean on a line of credit to get you through that year, right? Don't use your reserve money that's allocated and spoken for to pay for a shortfall in operating if you can avoid it. Let's see. Is interest on reserves taxable? Please explain and how to account for that. Typically, no, is my understanding. Associations are not-for-profit entities. I'm not a CPA, but I believe the form they file at tax time is an 1120H, which means that they don't have to pay taxes on interest, but not being a CPA, I'll leave it at that and advise you to speak to one. But typically, no, I don't believe they are paying tax there. Okay, can lake banks be added to a reserve study? Can they be repaired with common ground reserves if not on the reserve study? 2 different questions there. Yes, they can be added if the lake banks have some predictable, recurring, expensive work that needs to be done. Shoreline stabilization, replacing the erosion control measures that might be in place. That can be a reserve study component, not necessarily all the time, but it can be. The second question, can they be repaired with those common ground reserves if not on the reserve study? I'd have to look at that one more carefully. When you say common ground reserves, that sounds very broad. So, that's by definition, almost any common area might be applicable for that, but you would really want to have it itemized specifically with its own life expectancy and cost affiliated there. Lots of questions talking about pooled reserves. Yes, they are very much in place still. Someone's asking for a link to download this funding manual. I don't have it off the top of my head, but I think if you Googled Florida DBPR budgets and reserves manual, that should probably pull it up fairly easy. It's a PDF file. I want to say 100 pages or so. That's the thing I mentioned earlier that talks about the association going down to having pooled reserves with $4 left, right? So it's in the manual. Let's see. We were told that a minimum of 10% was supposed to be in the reserves when we purchased in order to get financing. Is this true? Yes, that is one of the criteria for certain government-backed loans, that a minimum of 10% of the annual budget needs to go into reserves in order for the building itself to qualify as eligible for those types of mortgages. So to my understanding, there's very few condos in Florida that have met all the requirements, but yes, that can be one of the criteria that banks and lenders want to see, or is at least 10% of the budget going into the reserves. And if not, then they may not issue a loan there. Okay. Yeah, talked as much as I felt I could about the SERS requirements. We've got a whole new topic on our whole separate webinar on that. Okay. Now that we're down to the wire, I'm going to try to get a couple of these quick ones. All right, here's one that is a very common misconception. Okay, Someone says, I was under the impression that we need to be fully funded as shown by SERS by the end of this year. So let me explain what the requirement is. The requirement does not say that you need to be fully funded by the end of 2024 or, start of 25 or any point in the future. What it says is that if you have pooled reserves, you need to demonstrate that you are fully funding, and I'm using their terminology, I'm going to call that baseline funding, that you will have achieved the replacement cost of each component by the time it fails, okay? So let's say you've got a component that costs $100,000 and it has a life of 10 years. You would put 10 grand away each year for 10 years over the course of its lifespan, in theory, right? And I'm ignoring inflation for the moment. Let's say it's halfway through its life, it's 5 years old. You should have $50,000 in the bank. That would make you fully funded using the national standard definition. It's the proportion of the cost that you should have in hand based on the age. There is no obligation under the new laws to put 50 grand in the bank right now if you don't have it. It just means that over the next 5 years, when that thing gets to a point of failure, you need to have 100 grand by then. So if you're starting at zero in this scenario, you would need to save something like 20 grand a year for the next 5 years so that when it fails, you have enough money for it. So the requirement is to begin fully funding or to continue fully funding for all of your SERS components, not to make up for lost time, right? If you have waived reserves for the last 25 years, starting from zero, the state is not telling you that you need to make up for those past 25 years in 1 year and have everyone write a massive check to get caught up. Just means that going forward, you need to put away enough money so that you stay out of trouble. Okay, I'm gonna try to do maybe one or two more. Can reserve funds be used for new capital projects such as pickleball courts? I presume not. Yes, generally speaking, you can't use reserve money to pay for something that you don't already have. It's meant to be for repairs, replacements, renovations of existing things. So if you're going to take a piece of land and put in some new pickleball courts that you don't have now, that's not a good use of reserve funds. Now, if you're going to repurpose existing tennis courts and turn them into pickleball courts, that might be appropriate. You're taking one sport court and repurposing it into a different type. That amenity exists, it's just a different type of amenity now. So in that scenario, I think that could be a worthy use of reserve funds because you would have had to do something to the tennis courts anyways, but creating something out of nothing, generally not a reserve component. Okay, I'm gonna pick out one more here. Yes, the presentation is going to be emailed to everybody. Thank you guys for being here. Okay, I'll pick this one as the last one. When and how can you revise replacement costs or useful lives? I would say as soon as you know that they're different, right? Every year when you prepare the budget, there needs to be a new reserve schedule prepared there. You should be adapting that schedule based on the present day, right? So if the costs have changed, the life expectancies have changed, course correct every year with your budget. That way you will not drift too far off course. Your funding levels will be appropriate. You will stay on track and hopefully stay out of trouble. So that, I think, brings us to the end. I really appreciate all the questions. I'm sorry we ran out of time. Thanks, everybody. We still have a few hundred of you who stayed in this whole time. So again, Ashley, everybody at Campbell, thanks for having me, and I look forward to the next one.
Thanks for watching. For more great educational content, click the subscribe button now.